Friends and guests, we welcome you to the third annual Howard R. Driggs Memorial Lecture. Annually during the Founders Week at SUU, we remember the contributions of our institution's first professor of English, Howard R. Driggs, and his distinguished career as an educator and historian of the West. Born of parents who crossed the plains to Utah as children, as a youth, Dr. Driggs was inspired by stories told by his parents and their friends about the history of his people and his country. With earnings from his first job, he bought a copy of 100 Years of American Independence, which set the course of his life as an educator and as a trails historian. Tonight we have many members of the Oregon-California Trails Association with us who have gathered to Cedar City this weekend. And Dr. Driggs and his partners kind of in trails history, Ezra Meeker and William Henry Jackson, were the first people, and now the Oregon-California Trails carries on that work. Tonight we thank the Howard R. Driggs Foundation and Dr. Allen and Kathy Christensen, the SUU Honors Program and the SUU Convocations Program, and the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Visiting Scholars Program. All of these people and foundations have made contributions which allowed us to invite Mr. Dayton Duncan, not only to speak tonight, but to spend the day with a number of Southern Utah University students in their classrooms. And one of the classrooms today was Kolob section of Zion National Park. It was just an absolutely amazing day to be with him and have him interacting with our students, and I think they will not soon forget this marvelous opportunity. Each year we invite a scholar whose passion for America parallels that of Dr. Driggs. And as I've been with Mr. Duncan today, I see that passion. I know that these are two men who would have been great friends were they to have been in the same century. At the close of our lecture, and I will come up, I guess, at that time, Mr. Duncan has agreed to answer some questions from members of the audience. And also, we've invited the SUU bookstore to have copies of books written by him. He's written very many. We have 3 of the books written by him, and they will be sold in the back, and Mr. Duncan will stay a few minutes and sign books at that time. I'd like now, one more thing. There will be a kind of reception. There will be cookies in the foyer outside the room when things are finished. I now introduce to you Dr. Michael T. Benson, who's president of our institution, for an introduction of Mr. Duncan.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. We had a chance last evening to host a dinner at our home for Mr. Duncan. And I unfortunately was pretty ill. It was a self-diagnosis of Jimmer Fredette fever. It was actually food poisoning, but I rose from my deathbed, and here I am, in spite of the game going on as we speak. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here. It's not every day we get an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker on campus, and Janet told me earlier that the students were really the beneficiaries today of Mr. Duncan, and that's what we're all about, is the impact on these young people, these students on our campus. This, as you know, is the 3rd annual Howard R. Driggs Memorial Lecture. We've had 2 outstanding lectures. The inaugural was given by Michael Levitt. Last year we had one of my professors in graduate school, Professor Howe, Daniel Howe. And I want to especially single out Camille Bradford, who is here, and other members of the board for their continued support of this lecture. When we have the chance to bring together people from our community, from our campus, and showcase the kinds of things we have on campus to people from outside of our community, and they in turn can share their perspective with us, that to me is the ultimate win-win, and we're delighted to have Mr. Duncan with us. As you know, he's an award-winning writer and documentary filmmaker, as well as an author of 10 books. Let me just give you a quick summary of some of these works. Out West, A Journey Through Lewis and Clark's America, which chronicles his retracing of the Lewis and Clark Trail. It was a Book of the Month Club alternate selection finalist for the Western Writers of America Spur Award. Grassroots, 1 year in the life of the New Hampshire presidential primary. A unique look at presidential politics through the experiences of grassroots volunteers. Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Corps of Discovery, published in November of 1997. Mark Twain, published in November 2001. And Horatio's Drive, 2003. And the one that we're probably the most familiar with, The National Parks, America's Best Idea, are companion books to documentary films that Dayton wrote and produced. Scenes of Visionary Enchantment, Reflections on Lewis and Clark, is a collection of essays released in conjunction with the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. In addition, Duncan's articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, American Heritage Magazine, the Old Farmer's Almanac, and many other publications. Duncan has been involved for many years with the work of documentary filmmaker and his friend Ken Burns. He was consultant on Burns' award-winning series for public television, The Civil War, baseball, and jazz. For a 12-hour series about the history of the American West, broadcast in 1996, Duncan was the co-writer and consulting producer. It won the Eric Barneau Award for the Organization of American Historians. He is the writer and producer of Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Corps of Discovery, a 4-hour documentary broadcast that first aired in November of 1997. The film attained the second highest ratings, following only the Civil War, in the history of PBS, and won a Western Heritage Award from the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, a Spur Award from the American Writers of America, and a Cine Gold Eagle, as well as many other honors. His most recent film with Burns is The National Parks, America's Best Idea, which he wrote and produced. It won 2 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Nonfiction Series and Outstanding Writing for Nonfiction Programming. Born and raised in Indianola, Iowa, Duncan graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1971 with a degree in German literature and was also a fellow at Harvard's Shorenstein Center for Press, Politics, and Public Policy. That just goes to show, Duncan, that there are degrees to somewhere, like in German literature and history and politics and sociology and all those good soft sciences that too often get short shrift. He holds honorary doctorates from Franklin Pierce University, Keene State College, and Drake University. For the last 40 years, he has lived in New Hampshire, where he makes his home in the small town of Walpole with his wife Diane and their 2 children. If I can invite Dayton to come forward, please. He has captured the West beautifully through his writings and through film. And as many of you know, there was a giant among us who unfortunately passed away just a few months ago, Jim Jones, who captured on canvas the beauty of this topography that we're so blessed with. And I would like to present Dayton with this book. Jim Jones, it's the catalog of his last exhibition that was shown here at the university. As you know, many of these original pieces of work came to the university and will be housed in our soon-to-be built SUMA, the Southern Utah Museum of Art. So, Dayton, thank you so much for being here, and thank you. We hope you enjoy this book of paintings of Jim Jones. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Benson and Debbie, for the great dinner last night and for inviting me here. My mother used to say that when she heard my resume, that it seemed like a resume of a migrant worker with a BA degree. So German literature, I am either the cautionary tale for people going into liberal arts, or I'm the poster child for a good liberal arts education. I'll let you be the decider of which that is. Coming here tonight, I was reminded of the story of Horace Albright, who was then the deputy director of the National Park Service and the creation of Zion National Park. In 1917, Albright had been invited by Douglas White, who was an official of the Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad, to come to southern Utah to visit Mukuntuweap National Monument, which White believed was an undiscovered jewel in the loose string of scenic wonders that Albright and his boss, Stephen Mather, were trying to mold into a unified system of national parks. Albright joined White in Los Angeles and took the train to Lund, the closest station to here at the time, 35 rough miles, which they then covered by car. And along the way from the station to Cedar City, White scolded Albright that Mukuntuweap National Monument was being neglected and overlooked by officials in Washington. It had a budget of $120 a year and paid a salary of $1 a month for its custodian. He said the Park Service needed to invest more in upgrading the monument's facilities and put more effort into its promotion, and he said that he was sure that many of the people in Cedar City would support it becoming a full-fledged national park. What he didn't tell Albright was that he had invited many of those people to come hear the deputy director of the National Park Service talk about his plans for Mukuntuweap. So sure enough, when Albright's car pulled into Cedar City, a large crowd had gathered in the center of town waiting to hear him speak. And a little flustered by this surprise, because he didn't know he was being expected to speak, Albright nonetheless climbed up into the back of the big touring car that he was in and gave, as he recalled later, quote, a rousing, impromptu speech about the National Park Service and about the beauties of Utah. What Albright didn't mention in that rousing speech was that he'd never been to Utah before. So I'm going to return to Horace Albright in a moment, but I just wanted to assure you that I have been to Utah before, many times. My wife, Diane, still considers Bryce Canyon as one of her favorite national parks, and I've had many, many unforgettable experiences all over this beautiful state, and it's good to be back. And I also want to thank, besides President Benson and his wife, Janet Sigmiller and John I, for their work in bringing me here, to Camille Bradford and other Driggs relatives for their role in this whole series and for mine being here. A little shout out to the students who came to some of the classes and resisted falling asleep while I was speaking. I appreciated that. I know you're here because you have to be here if you're going to get the extra credit that your teachers did. I fully understand that. Anything to get a crowd. And I would also like to ask if there are people here who work for or have in the past worked for the National Park Service to please stand up. On behalf of everyone here and the American people, I want to thank you for the work that you do to protect the treasures that are entrusted to you. As I told some people last night and today, one of the great surprise honors for me was in April of 2009 at the auditorium of the Interior Department in Washington, D.C., when the director of the National Park Service bestowed upon both Ken Burns and myself the title of Honorary Park Ranger, which has been bestowed on about 50 people, and a number of them are dead presidents. So I felt I was in very lofty company. And the great thing, besides the certificate that I got, is I got the hat, with the flat brim, and which we have in our house. And whenever I get crabby or grumpy, then Diane goes and gets the ranger hat. Or if my kids are home, they'll get it and bring it over and put the hat on me, because they know that I can't be grumpy when I'm wearing my honorary ranger hat. So I salute my fellow rangers. I want to recognize Ryan Paul, who was here who works at the Frontier Homestead State Park. Ryan helped us in some of the research that we were doing when we were putting our film together. And Ryan, will you stand up, wave your hand or something? Thank you very much. And I'm very honored that here tonight is a person that I had the great honor to interview on camera for our film in the home of the superintendent of Zion National Park, because as he said in his interview, in which portions of which we use in our film, he grew up with the park. Mr. J.L. Crawford, who is here, if you don't know Mr. Crawford's story, I was going to say, if you don't know his story, then you should buy the DVD of our film, and I'm not going to tell you where it is. You got to watch out 12 hours. He was born in a homestead that is on the site now of where the visitor center, I think the old visitor center, used to be. He grew up watching the first tourists coming into Zion National Park, washed dishes at the Zion Lodge, and used to listen in afterwards at the interpretive talks that rangers would give and think, boy, wouldn't it be great someday to be a park ranger. And after he came back after serving his country in World War II, he did become an interpretive park ranger for Bryce and for Zion National Park, and is still very active he retired just about a year ago, I think. He's still very active with the park, a great inspiration to people to know about what he gave to the park and how he continues to give to it. And one of my favorite moments in our film is when he is talking about his clear, unabashed affection for Zion. So thank you for being here, Mr. Crawford. In the course of more than a quarter of a century of making documentary films for PBS, we at Florentine Films have presented the pageant of American history through a variety of prisms. In a long list of biographical films, we looked in great detail at the lives and times of significant Americans, from one of the nation's founders, Thomas Jefferson, to the first black heavyweight boxing champion, Jack Johnson, from the intrepid explorers Lewis and Clark, to the path-breaking suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, from architects, Frank Lloyd Wright, to artists, Thomas Hart Benton, from politicians, Huey Long, to novelists, Mark Twain. We've probed aspects of the American character through films on two iconic landmarks, the Statue of Liberty and the Brooklyn Bridge, two transformative inventions, radio and the automobile, a religious sect, the Shakers, and an institution at the bedrock of our democracy, the Congress. We have followed the nation into its two most cataclysmic conflicts, the Civil War and World War II. And through a group of multi-episode series, baseball, jazz, the West, we have examined the longer sweep of our nation's history, always searching for new ways to answer a simple yet elusive question. Who are we, Americans? Who are we? Most recently, for nearly 10 years, that search took us back and forth across this remarkable continent to some of its most beautiful places, including a number near here, in pursuit of the story of the national parks and what that story might tell us about these people who call themselves Americans. And what a journey it was. Can I just state right here that I have the best job in America? I've believed that for a long time, but I really knew it was true when I started on the project of the national parks, because just think about it. For nearly a decade, my job required me to travel to all 58 of the national parks, to meet the people who knew the most about them, to learn how they had been created, to discover the stories we would want to tell, and to scout the locations we would want to shoot. And then my job required me to come back to those places with a camera crew to capture on film the most beautiful places on earth in the most beautiful moments of the day, at dawn and at dusk. And that's right, for all those years, a condition of my employment was to spend as much time as possible in places like Zion and Bryce, here in Utah, or Canyonlands and Arches and Capitol Reef, and much farther afield from the Everglades in Florida to the gates of the Arctic in Alaska, from the tranquil shores of Acadia on an island off the coast of Maine, to the volcanoes, some dormant and one very, very active one on the islands of Hawaii. From the lowest and hottest location in the hemisphere at the bottom of Death Valley to the highest point on the continent, more than 20,000 spectacular feet above sea level, a mountain so massive it creates its own weather. We call it Mount McKinley, but its older and more appropriate name is Denali, the high one. I went from standing in the middle of California forests of sequoia trees, the largest living things on earth, and then redwoods, the tallest living things on earth, to camping on a mountaintop not all that far from here in Nevada's Great Basin National Park, near a grove of bristlecone pines, the oldest living things on earth, trees that were alive and already, half of their life had been lived by the time of Christ. Trees that were saplings and growing before Rome had conquered the known world, before the Greeks worshipped in the Parthenon, before the Egyptians built the pyramids. Those trees, some of them, were already growing on those mountaintops not that far from here. I made sure that our camera crew, I brought my son Will with me, and I said, Will, take a picture of me next to one of these bristlecone pines so you can write a caption, Dayton Duncan, next to the oldest living thing on earth. Depends on where you punctuate it. Think about it. My job took me to Yellowstone, the first national park in human history, a geological wonderland with mud that boils and holes that spout steam hundreds of feet into the air, the greatest collection of geysers in the world, and of course to a mile-deep gash in the ground not all that far from here, the grandest canyon on earth, where the Hopis say the first people emerged from the underworld, and where scientists say a river has patiently carved its way to expose rocks that are 1.7 billion years old, the Precambrian Vishnu schist. And I would posit that we're the only film company in America that's ever gotten those words into a documentary film. Precambrian Vishnu schist. 1.7 billion years old, nearly half the age of the planet itself. That was the first part of my job. And the next part was to try to put it all together in a script and then turn it into a film, and doing all of that with my best friend Ken Burns, who just happens to be the best filmmaker in America. And now you know why I say that I do have the best job in the nation. If somebody disputes that, we can talk about it later. Early in our project, we decided that our film would not be a travelogue telling people the best place to stay in a national park or simply recounting the most notable features of it. And it would not be a nature film per se, though nature, the role of nature and our relationship to it would be one of the central themes of the film. What we were interested in was telling a human story, filled admittedly with some spectacular backdrops for it, but a human historical story filled with real people and their real lives and their often inspiring and yet very real accomplishments. We wanted to tell the story of an idea that was born in this country a century after the nation's founding, an idea as uniquely American as the Declaration of Independence, and just as radical. That our most majestic, our most special, and I would say our most sacred places should be set aside not for royalty or the rich or the well-connected, but for everyone and for all time. It was our idea as Americans, and that's why we called our film, The National Parks, America's Best Idea, borrowing admittedly, as we say in our film, and directly from the great writer and historian and Utahn, Wallace Stegner, who called it the best idea we ever had. National Parks, Wallace Stegner added, are, quote, absolutely American, absolutely democratic. They reflect us at our best rather than our worst. They are a cure for cynicism, an exhilarating rest from the competitive avarice we sometimes call the American way. Now, in calling it the best idea, you have to recall that we had already done a film about Thomas Jefferson, and the basis of my early friendship with Ken back 30-some years ago, while I was writing books and he was making his first films, we realized that we had an interest in history and an interest in storytelling, but we also realized that for us, the two of us, the 4th of July is the most special holiday of the year, and that both of us would wake up and read to our young children the Declaration of Independence, including the list of grievances and everything else. That we believe that those are immortal words, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words, that idea, is the best idea, is this continent's best idea. That's the idea that created our nation. But once we became a nation, I would argue, the national parks are America's best idea because, in effect, the national parks are the Declaration of Independence applied to the land, both in terms of ensuring places for the pursuit of happiness, but more importantly, as places where everyone is an equal owner with equal standing. Our greatest conservationist president, Theodore Roosevelt, understood this. The national park idea, he said, is noteworthy in its essential democracy, one of the best bits of national achievement which our people have to their credit, and our people should see to it, he said, that they are preserved for their children and their children's children forever, with their majestic beauty all unmarred. Over time, like the national park idea, like the idea of what do we mean all men are created equal, what does that really mean? The national park idea has spread not just across the continent, but all over the world, becoming, like the idea of freedom, one of America's greatest exports, with more than 4,000 parks in more than 200 countries around the globe. And it has evolved just as the idea of freedom and what that means of who the people are when we say all men are created equal. But it all started here, in this country. And like the idea of America itself, filled with competing demands between local rights and those of the nation, between the impulses of idealism and exploitation, between the sacred and the profitable, between the immediate desires of one generation and its obligation and promise to the next. The national park idea has been constantly debated, constantly tested, and is constantly evolving, just like the idea of freedom, which began in 1776 when they said all men are created equal. They said, if you'd asked the follow-up question, fortunately nobody did, so it wasn't written down that this is what was meant, but they meant all white men of property without debt were created equal. And the journey of our nation has been to expand and evolve those inspirational words so that they started to include white men who had debt. And then black men, and then Native Americans, and finally in the early 20th century, the majority of us, women, were also deemed to have been created equal. That is the story of our nation, is the evolution and the expansion of the idea of freedom. And the idea of the national parks has evolved and expanded just as well. In 1864, in the midst of our greatest cataclysm, the Civil War, which had the potential of destroying the United States as a nation, at the midst of that, President Abraham Lincoln signed a bill that set aside a lovely valley in California, Yosemite, and a grove of majestic sequoias, which he had never seen and would never see. In the midst of all that, he set aside this place and said, with a bill of Congress that said, this place will not be homesteaded, will not become private property. It is going to be set aside for everybody, for all time. At that moment, human history was being changed, because up to that moment, no nation had ever done anything like that. They gave it into the care at that time of the state of California and said, we are setting aside this federal land. Here, state of California, it is now up to you to make sure that it is preserved forever. 8 years later, in 1872, Congress had been presented with a scientific survey about a place of rumors somewhere off in the west at the headwaters of the Yellowstone River, a place that mountain men had been writing letters about or talking about for some time. Jim Bridger, the great mountain man, Joe Meek, the great mountain man, had said it reminded him of the place he had been warned about when he went to Sunday school. Jim Bridger, who told even taller tales, or were known for telling taller tales, there was a place there you could catch a fish in a lake and then dip the line over and cook it in a hot spring. And there was a valley so deep, he said, you could shout down into it at night, shout your name down into it at night, and be awakened in the morning by your own echo. Well, now there was a government survey that had come back looking into this place that all these things were rumored to be, and said that, well, there wasn't that much of an exaggeration. They had the scientific reports to show, to measure how deep that canyon was and how hot that water was next to that sparkling lake and how tall those geysers were. But they also brought back the paintings of a young artist by the name of Thomas Morand, and I think more importantly because art is art, and how important it has been to the national parks and how expressive it is, but you never know, did the artist really see it or are they making something up? They brought back the photographs of William Henry Jackson, a Civil War veteran who had gone west for adventure, served as a bullwhacker on a wagon trail along the California Trail, and later used his camera to chronicle the lives of Plains Indians and, most importantly, the building of the first transcontinental railroad. So you had the official reports of a government survey, you had Morand's paintings, but you also had Jackson's photographs, which they hung in the rotunda of the Capitol. So the people voting on whether a place should be set aside where these rumors had been emanating for 50 years should be set aside. And I personally believe that that was probably one of the most persuasive parts of the argument. They wanted to follow the Yosemite model, but Wyoming was not a state in 1872. It was a territory. And so almost by accident, they decided, well, we will make this into a national park, there being no state to give it to. And at that moment, again, human history was being changed, because that was the world's first national park. That model of being a national park ultimately proved to be a better model than the Yosemite model of giving it to the state. The different interests that wanted to still encroach upon the Yosemite grant had a better and easier time of it in the California legislature than they might have in the halls of Congress. That's kind of hard to believe, I know, but nonetheless, it was true at the time. They wanted to paint some of the granite of the walls to try to make it look better. They had pigsties and other things. They wanted to shine lights on Yosemite Falls, and they had lots of people who were planning to do it and make money for it. But they finally were convinced instead to make Yosemite into a national park. If you think about it, if Yellowstone had been made Yellowstone State Park in Wyoming, the geysers would ostensibly still be going off, we would hope. All the things that draw us there would still be there, we would hope. But it still wouldn't quite be the same to us as American citizens who feel that correctly that Yellowstone is something that I'm a part owner of, and each of you out here are a part owner of. And so that model that started almost accidentally set us on a path as part of an evolutionary change that spread across the West. The big Western parks, the big landscapes were the ones that were what national parks were supposed to be. And then in 1906, Mesa Verde was set aside, not because of its great scenic natural beauty, but because it represented the archaeological remains of a civilization that flowered in the Southwest 1,000 years ago. And it was decided that a national park could also be something that preserved that physical memory of that civilization. In about 13 years later, Acadia National Park was set aside, and then the Great Smoky Mountains, the first parks east of the Mississippi, where there wasn't federal land that Congress could just set aside. It's already been, all of it had been privatized. And at Acadia first, and then also down at Great Smoky Mountains, predominantly wealthy individuals, in one instance at Acadia, said, we love this place so much where we have these summer homes that we're going to buy up the rest of this island, and then we're going to give it to the American people so that everyone can enjoy this rocky coast of New England before it is all bought up and no one will have a chance to enjoy it. And in the Great Smoky Mountains, it was the states of Tennessee and the state of North Carolina, and again, sometimes some wealthy individuals, but also the senior class plays in the surrounding towns donated the returns for their plays. The bellmen at the hotels chipped in $1 or $2. Little kids in the segregated schools of black and white in North Carolina and Tennessee raided their piggy banks and added pennies to the drive to buy up the land of the last stand of virgin timber in the southeast to create Great Smoky Mountains National Park. That was a new evolution in the park. And a little later, farther south, down in the Everglades, that was set aside not for scenic beauty, because if anybody's been there, you could spend a long time looking for a mountaintop or a waterfall, but instead set aside solely for the preservation of animals and plants and the environment that sustains them. That was a new turn, a new evolution in the national park idea. It evolved again in 1933 when Horace Albright, the guy who came here and praised the beauties of Utah before he had the benefit of actually seeing them. Horace Albright, by this point, was the second director of the Park Service and had a chance to ride with newly inaugurated President Franklin Delano Roosevelt over to the Shenandoah Valley. And on the ride back, they started talking about the Civil War battlefields that they were passing. And Albright had a long time had a dream that the National Park Service was better suited to preserve and tell the story of those Civil War battlefields and some other parts of our history than the Department of War, as it was called then. That should be part of the mission of the national park idea. And Roosevelt went along with it, and so in that first instance, Yorktown, where the climatic battle of our freedom was fought, and Gettysburg and Antietam, some of the bloodiest battles, and Appomattox Courthouse, where that conflict was finally ended, the Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore, Washington Monument were set aside and given to the Park Service as part of the park idea, and the Lincoln Memorial, the shrine to the president who in 1864 had given the national park idea its first tentative expression. That meant that national parks now embrace not just scenic places, archaeological sites, important environments, but now national parks embrace the idea of America itself. And it has continued expanding and evolving ever since. Great additions in Alaska, scenic seashores and lake shores, national monuments, an expansion of what kind of historic sites we should preserve, not just battlefields and statues or birthplaces of presidents, but places like Little Rock High School, Central High School in Little Rock, where the battle of crisis of segregation first flashed. The Manzanar internment camp to remind us of part of our history that we can learn from in a way that it might not be repeated. Oklahoma City as a commemoration of 168 people who died in an unspeakable act of domestic terrorism, and now Shanksville, Pennsylvania, as a memorial to the passengers of United Flight number 53 on 9/11. Those things became part of the national park system and the national park idea that now has 58 national parks in a larger system that includes historic sites and monuments and others of nearly 400. But the idea of the story of the national park idea, as we learned, is more than just the story of those places that we have set aside for ourselves and our children. What fascinated Ken and me were the stories of the people who were instrumental in creating those parks. People from every conceivable background, rich and poor, famous and unknown, soldiers and scientists, natives and newcomers, idealists, artists, and entrepreneurs. People who were willing to devote themselves to saving some precious portion of the land they loved, and in doing so reminded all of us of the full meaning of democracy. Zion, for instance, was created by the work of a coalition of people and interests. As I said at the start, Horace Albright arrived here in 1917 at the invitation of the Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad, soon to become part of the Union Pacific. And judging by the crowd, the surprise crowd that greeted him here in Cedar City, a lot of other people, obviously, were already in favor of something more being made of the canyon that had been carved by the Virgin River eons ago. The day after his speech, Albright rode to that canyon for the first time in an 8-passenger touring car operated by Gronway and Chauncey Perry. With him were former State Senator Henry Lunt, R.A. Thurley, and David Hershey, the Rockville Bishop of the Mormon Church. They all wanted Albright to become an advocate back in Washington for making Mukuntuweap National Monument a national park. And once he got there, as is true many times, it wasn't a hard sell. The parks, those places can sell themselves. Here's what Albright said about seeing that valley, that canyon for the first time. He said, "I was surprised, excited, and thrilled More than that, I was just plain stunned. I had no concept of the staggering beauty I beheld. Local Utah people had said that Yosemite was really just a Zion without color. But this didn't faintly prepare me for the reality of the towering rock walls, splashed with brilliant hues of tans and reds interspersed with whites. The great towers, temples, spires, and peaks appeared unearthly as they encircled the narrow, lush gorge cut by the sparkling Virgin River. It was love at first sight for me. I was so impressed, he said, that I determined we should expand Makuntaweep and have it made a national park. And so he wrote a letter to his boss, Stephen Mather, who immediately wrote back, "You must have been taken in by the local Chamber of Commerce." He couldn't believe that, Horace Albright, not always the most expressive man, unlike his boss, the very excitable, brimming with enthusiasm, Stephen Mather, but he could gush so about a place. So he thought he had been captured by the Chamber of Commerce. And you also should know that Mather's favorite park was Yosemite. So somebody saying that this place topped Yosemite was not a good way to get a promotion with Stephen Mather. But back in Washington, Albright's enthusiasm was undiminished and was enough to convince President Woodrow Wilson to expand the national monument, which he could do as a present with the Antiquities Act, and to change its name in 1918 from Makuntaweep, which Albright believed was too hard to pronounce, impossible to spell, and difficult to remember, to change it to the name that the local Mormons had always used for that canyon, Zion, the New Jerusalem, that paradise set aside by God for the pure at heart. And then Albright went to work with Utah Senator Reed Smoot to make Zion a national park in 1919. 1919, the same year Acadia and the Grand Canyon became national parks. A very, very vintage year for the national park idea was 1919. Now, by now, Stephen Mather had decided maybe he should come out and take his first peek at this place and to see Zion for himself. And when he got here, he was immediately realized it was as stunning as Albright had promised, but not to be outdone by his deputy in this Utah Discovery Department. Mather decided to check out another canyon he had heard about in the area, the one that was named for Ebenezer Bryce. He was taken there, I was going to say, who said, "It's a hell of a place to lose a cow." We've been told by some of his descendants that he may not have ever said that. We were very careful in our film to say who reportedly said, so we're dodging that one. Albright was taken there in a touring car by Lafayette Hanchett, a banker friend, brought along Gilbert Grosvenor, a personal friend of Mather's, who was the president of the National Geographic Society. And as they approached the lip of the canyon, Hanchett asked them to close their eyes and not open them until he gave them the go-ahead. So just when they got to the edge, Hanchett told them to open their eyes. And of course, there at their feet was that unbelievable, that exquisite amphitheater of salmon-colored hoodoos. It's a unique geological spectacle that can never be adequately described, and for which even photographs and even films can never do justice. Mather, reportedly by the people who were there, became agitated and so excited by the sight that he started scrambling as fast as he could to every possible observation point, all the while exclaiming at the top of his voice that this place too had to be designated as a national park. He was so excited that when he and Hanchett and Grosvenor finally arrived here in Cedar City at the end of a long day's drive, Mather realized he was ravenously hungry, and the reason was he had been so excited back at Bryce Canyon that he hadn't even bothered to eat the picnic lunch that they had packed and everybody else had been eating while he was running around saying this place has to be a national park. Here in Cedar City, he learned that a group of businessmen led by Randall Jones, a local architect, were talking about building a new hotel in town to house the tourists they hoped would someday be coming to this area. Mather was so enthusiastic about that, he whipped out his checkbook and wrote out a check for $500 to invest in it. Now today, the National Park Service director investing in a new hotel near a place that he says should become a national park would raise at least a couple of congressional inquiries. But that was the way Mather was. He wasn't so much interested in making any money out. He just wanted to make sure the darn hotel got built. And so he put up $500 for it. That hotel was the one that became the El Escalante. Mather's vision was much more expansive than that. And Stephen Mather could be very, very persuasive. He thought that the national parks represented what he called an empire of grandeur. It's a wonderful phrase, an empire of grandeur. And he also called them vast schoolrooms of Americanism, which is also a wonderful phrase, believing that people who visited one of the special places the nation had set aside for them would depart a better citizen, prouder of his or her country, not just for possessing such a scenic marvel, but for having the wisdom to have preserved it. He also believed, Mather did, that the national parks were good for business. He called national parks an economic asset of national importance. He believed that they would be good for the balance of trade for the nation as a whole, good for the local economies, good for a lot of other businesses. He aligned himself very closely with the railroads, who in the early years of the national parks were instrumental in getting the political muscle of Congress to create a national park because it was going to be good for their business. Before there was a National Park Service, the railroads in essence ran the show in the national parks. Mather believed that he should work with them to develop the parks, to get more parks. He aligned himself with the newfangled horseless carriage because he believed the automobile had a great future. He believed that the automobile could democratize the national parks because more people could come than just those who could afford a train ticket and the fancy hotels and other things that were in the national parks. He aligned himself with auto clubs, local chambers of commerce, tourism offices, because national parks, he believed, were good for the spirit and good for the soil, but also good economics. He later brought Carl Gray, the president of the Union Pacific, and Heber Grant, president of the church, and also a board member of the Union Pacific. He brought them down for his own personal tour, not that they were unfamiliar, at least that Heber Grant was unfamiliar, but he wanted to have them in the car with him as he talked to them as they came down this area, and began lobbying relentlessly to have the UP build a spur line from Lund to Cedar City and to take over the newly built El Escalante. He lobbied them to build grand lodges in Zion and at Bryce and at the north rim of the Grand Canyon and at Cedar Breaks National Monument, and then to organize a system of bus tours that would take Union Pacific passengers to each one, an unforgettable loop that began and ended here in Cedar City, and that provided thousands upon thousands of people with the trip of their lives. Stephen Mather could be very, very persuasive. He is truly one of the heroes of the national park idea, but he is not alone. What we found in researching our film is that if you turn over the rock of any national park, you find the story of a person, a couple of people, a group of people who loved a place so much, who desperately loved that place so much that they devoted themselves to saving it so that other people that they would never meet, in generations that they would never know, might have the same chance to see that place the same way that they had and to fall in love with it too. And those heroes are Americans from every walk of life. From John D. Rockefeller Jr., the richest man in America, who did so much for Acadia and also the Tetons, to Lancelot Jones, the son of a former slave, who helped save Biscayne Bay in Florida, the last undeveloped string of keys, small islands between Miami and Key West. And Lancelot Jones, the son of a former slave, was critical in the effort to save that. From Virginia McClure, again, a group of women's clubs in Colorado who fought to make Mesa Verde a national park, to preserve it, because at that time, when they launched their crusade, tourists were coming and just looting the artifacts that were there. They would take little pieces of dynamite and drop them down into the ruins to detonate, to scare off the rattlesnakes so they could come down and muck around in it as they wished. And Virginia McClure and these women's clubs in Colorado set about to try to lead a fight to make it a national park, to bring that to an end. So from a group like that, who were daughters of the American Revolution, to George Massa, who was a Japanese immigrant and a photographer whose photographs and whose life became devoted to joining the effort to save the Great Smoky Mountains. From a famous person like John Muir, the mountain prophet, whose writings were so essential to bring and make into national parks Yosemite and Mount Rainier and the Petrified Forest and Sequoia National Park and many others. To George Melendez Wright, a pioneering biologist who persuaded the Park Service that its mission was much more than protecting pretty scenery. Its mission included protecting nature itself. Ladies and gentlemen, they are all heroes. Their monuments are the parks they helped create, and their example is an inspiration for all of us to follow. Which brings me to one last story and one more hero of the national park idea, and he is the man for whom this lecture is named, Howard R. Driggs. Now, it's not for me to recount his long and eventful and achievement-filled life here. Suffice it to say in that respect that his interests were many, his dedication to them was as unwavering as his energy seems to have been prodigious. Author of 50 books. 50 books. I mean, wow. A doctorate, not an honorary doctorate, a real doctorate from NYU. You can feel how I'm shrinking here on the table just reading this thing. A man who helped launch what became this institution. A national expert in both the history of the American West and also the study of English literature. A man who conducted radio programs about the pioneers and trail riders he had known personally that were broadcast nationally, and much, much more. But what interests me here most for tonight is how Howard Driggs' story interweaves with this larger story of the national parks and the evolution of the national park idea. Having heard firsthand from the people who lived it, from his pioneer parents and grandparents, who were veterans of the handcart companies who crossed the Great Plains as part of the Great Westward Migration, he developed a visceral passion for history. To him, it wasn't a collection of dry facts and figures, names and dates. It was a series of stories. Stories that needed to be told and told and told again, so that history and its lessons would be remembered down through the generations. In learning more about Howard Driggs, I must admit I began, as you can tell, to feel a little bit of envy about him, not just because he wrote 40 books more than I have, but a lot for the fact that he heard all those great stories in person. For instance, besides the pioneer tales from his parents, he became a friend of, as Janet mentioned, Ezra Meeker. Ezra Meeker, students of Western history would know, joined a wagon train in Iowa in 1852 and headed to Oregon with it. More than half a century later, in 1906, at the age of 75, Meeker decided to do it all again, back on the Oregon Trail with an ox team at age 75. And later, before he died in his late 90s, he retraced the trail by automobile and then by airplane. How I would have loved to have met a man like Ezra Meeker, who had so many adventures and whose life spanned such an important period of our national history. What questions I would have had for him. But luckily for us all, Howard Driggs did meet him, asked all the right questions, and then worked with Meeker to produce a great book about the Oregon Trail. And after that, they collaborated on creating something perhaps more important, an organization, the Oregon Trail Memorial Association, later named the American Pioneer Trails Association, whose purpose was to preserve not just the stories of the overland trails, but what was left of the trails themselves. Dr. Driggs succeeded Meeker as the organization's president. In 1930, for instance, they sponsored a covered wagon centennial coinciding with the 100th anniversary of, by then, the late Ezra Meeker's birth, to bring national attention to the trails. And one of the great things that they did is they had an event that drew 10,000 people to Independence Rock in Wyoming. Now, I don't know how many people here have been to Independence Rock in Wyoming. Well, you know, that, as you can tell, that's got to be the only time in history that 10,000 people were ever there at the same time. I saw a video of it this morning that Camille showed to me. There's wonderful footage that was taken there. Probably would have made that particular bend in the Sweetwater River in 1930 the second largest city in Wyoming at that moment. 10,000 people at Independence Rock that he organized as a way to bring attention to the Oregon Trail. 5 years later, on the 75th anniversary of the Pony Express, Dr. Driggs and his association, which was dedicated by this point to making every mile of the Pony Express Trail, marking every mile, and locating the original sites of each station, organized a relay of 300 Boy Scouts to recreate Pony Express history by carrying a message by horse from Sacramento to St. Joseph, Missouri, from which it was taken by airplane to Washington, D.C. and the White House lawn, where Dr. Driggs, who had gotten on the airplane at St. Joseph and flown with this message, presented it on the White House lawn to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who I was told this morning, because many of you might know, Roosevelt was a great avid stamp collector, and here he had now something that was stamped that had just 75 years later made its way by horse and airplane from Sacramento back to Washington. So I'm sure that had a special place in his collection that Dr. Driggs presented him. So you can begin to see the sources of my envy. Even more, I think it springs from the fact that Dr. Driggs became a friend and benefactor of, in my mind, one of the great legends of the West, William Henry Jackson. You remember I mentioned him earlier, the Civil War veteran, ex-bullwhacker on the Immigrant Trail, artist who drew something down of Kolob Canyon, and I had the great honor of being given a copy of something that he sketched as he was on the trail back in the 1860s. The guy who chronicled the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and the last days of freedom for the Plains Indians. The very person who accompanied one of the early government surveys to the Yellowstone region, and the very man whose photographs helped persuade Congress to set aside the world's first national park. That, William Henry Jackson. And Howard R. Driggs became his friend and could hear all of the stories that he had directly from the horse's mouth, as it were. It was Dr. Driggs who convinced Jackson to write the book and wrote with him The Pioneer Photographer, a book about his experiences in the West, which provided the aging Jackson, who by this point was in his 90s, a modest income just after the stock market crash of 1929 had wiped out his retirement savings. Dr. Driggs was the same person who then invited Jackson to become the research secretary for the Trails Association, of which he was president, a job that I think Dr. Driggs created specifically for him, that Jackson loved because it took him west each summer from his home in New York, and which also carried what Jackson called a comfortable little salary. It provided him, Jackson, with the energy and the means to embark on yet another book, Time Exposure, a wonderful book, his autobiography, that Jackson published in 1940, 2 years before his death at age 99. I think it can safely be said that in befriending William Henry Jackson in the way that he did, in preserving that old Westerner's life, I think by a decade or so, Dr. Driggs also preserved some precious bits of Western history, still found today, available to us all, in Jackson's 2 books, that otherwise would never have been written and published. That alone would be a legacy worth leaving. But Dr. Driggs preserved something more than that. In his work to save the physical memory of America's great pioneer trails, in his tireless dedication to capturing the living stories of people who crossed them, in his recognition that both of those things, places on the landscape and places in memory, are worthy of national protection for all time, Howard Driggs was expanding the national park idea one more time. National parks and historic sites, he was saying, don't have to be just rectangular parcels of land around a spectacularly scenic piece of geology, or a circular or rectangular border of 160 or 200 acres of a battlefield, or a rectangular house lot of a president's birthplace. They could also be a long trail, stretching forward physically across the land toward a distant horizon, and simultaneously stretching back to our early memories as a nation. Horace Albright, who had helped the national park idea evolve in the first place into history as well as scenery, understood this immediately. He became a member of the Trails Association and a friend of Dr. Driggs. Both of them, in my mind, heroes of the national park idea. Because he died in 1963, Howard Driggs was not alive when his dream of greater recognition of all the pioneer trails and roads was finally achieved when Congress officially created the National Historic Trails System, formally making them part of the ever-evolving national park idea. His example, and those of all the other national park heroes, whether they helped create a new park like Horace Albright, pushed the park idea in a new direction like Howard Driggs, or devoted themselves to making an existing park a little better like J.L. Crawford, brings to mind for me something the great park creator and great park defender John Muir once wrote. It's one of my favorite quotes of his. And it applies to all of these people. Happy will be those who, having the power and the love and the benevolent forecast to create a park, will do it. They will not be forgotten. The trees and their lovers will sing their praises. In generations yet unborn, will rise up and call them blessed. This, he said, is true freedom, a good, practical sort of immortality. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. We have time for some... Thank you very much. We have time for some questions. If you just stand up, shout them out. If people need to go and see if their brackets have been busted for the basketball tournament, I will fully understand that as well. Yes, President Benson.
I know it's hard, kind of like the question of who's your favorite child, but you've been able to visit, I'm sure, all the parks. Do you have a few favorites and why?
My question is about, do I have favorite parks? I'm diplomatic enough to say that, of course, it's Zion. I used to say when we were making this film over the course of 10 years, and we would have, dinners and other things, Ken and I, or just me and our camera crew or whatever, and people would ask that question. And I would say, the first thing I would always say, my favorite park is whatever national park I'm in. And that was sort of a flippant answer, but it also was a true answer. There are no bad national parks. All of them are wonderful. All of them, they were set aside for a reason. Good gracious. And so, you explore that and you connect somehow to that, and you're grateful just to be alive, and you're grateful to be an American and to have the opportunity to be in those. And so, I love them all. Glacier National Park is my favorite park. I say that quietly here. I say it much more loudly when I'm in Montana. Glacier National Park is my favorite park, not because I think it is more spectacular than any of the other parks. It is a spectacular park, but it's not more spectacular than Zion. It's not more beautiful than Bryce, which, as I said, is one of Diane's favorite parks. It's not more necessarily awe-inspiring than the Grand Canyon. It is my favorite park because it is the park... I think for many people, your favorite park is not necessarily the sights you saw, it's who you were with when you saw those sights. Glacier National Park was a park that Diane and I went to when we were courting. It was the first park we took our children to. It is a park where my son and I went on one of his first sort of real hikes. We saw a group of mountain goats coming through. We had a wonderful time. I was encouraging my children and my wife and myself to keep diaries on that journey, which took us to a whole bunch of national parks. And that night, in his journal, in his little scrawl, block letters, Will wrote, "This has been the greatest, most exciting day of my life." And that's when that park became my favorite park, and we've been back many times. But it's the, as Ken likes to say, it's as much the hand you're holding as the site that you're seeing that makes your national park. And the great thing, I tend to get long-winded, so I'll try to just end this so I can take some more questions. But the great thing about the national park idea, besides the democracy of it, is this place that it saves these places where you can go and see things again the way that they were, knowing that you're also seeing things that people long before you saw and experienced. When you're there, when I went to my first national park as a kid, I remember how our family felt, because it was the first vacation we really took. And so it wasn't just that we were seeing these places, it was just how, it was different. It was special because we were in a new place in a new way. And when I went back there to those places with my children, I could stand there in Yellowstone and then at the shores of Jenny Lake and the Grand Tetons, and I was both that little kid again, and I was also my parents. And I could feel them. And you can feel the past rushing up, the memories that you had saved there, because it still looks the same as it did when you were a kid. And you can feel, and you can hope and pray that someday your kids would be standing there with their kids. And they would feel you. And it's not that that's the only place that this can happen as a national park, but because you are seeing the same thing. There's so much in our world that changes all the time. Where I grew up in this small town, the place where I used to go and hang out on a creek and play Robin Hood or Peter Pan with my friends and do things is now paved over and is a parking lot and apartments, and the other places that I would love to take my children to and say this was an important place for me, all gone, all changed. But those national parks are places where you made a special memory in the first place, and you can, with confidence, tuck that little memory away and know that when you come back a generation later, it's still there, waiting for you, fresh as it was on that time. So that's why Glacier is mine. Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
In the inventory, looking around the country, what would you add? I don't think you've done, but I don't know the places throughout the country. What would you try to include if you could add that to be in that inventory?
Oh, goodness. What would I add? Yeah, I could get in real trouble. I believe that we're not, I believe and I hope that we're not done with adding national parks and adding places that don't have to necessarily be national parks, perhaps as national monuments, that are important places to our history, important places to us as places that are just places of nature being left on its own. And they exist in the East and the Southwest and they exist everywhere. There's a movement right now in Maine by a woman who made a lot of money, and in the tradition of Burt's Bees. Do you know the Burt's, I don't know if those things are sold out, the little things for your hands and your lips and everything. Well, the woman who came up with that, a former housewife of Maine who came up with that and now made an awful lot of money, sort of in the tradition of John D. Rockefeller Jr. has been buying up a lot of the old timber company lands in great sections in the central part of Maine, and her hope is that someday she can then do what they did at Acadia and say, here is this huge tract of the great North Woods. Make it a national park. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of people in Maine who don't like that idea. And just as there is all around the country, when these things first come up, there's oftentimes a great opposition. When the Grand Canyon was proposed to be a national park in 1882, which would have made it the second national park on Earth, proposed by then Senator Benjamin Harrison, could not get any support in the Senate and the House, particularly because of Arizona's opposition to it, and bill after bill would die. Theodore Roosevelt, using the Antiquities Act, expanding the notion of what it could be used for, in 1908, finally got tired of the waiting and created Grand Canyon National Monument. And the people of Arizona went ballistic, and Congress went nuts. And it was another 11 years, and the Grand Canyon, which could have been the second national park in the world, not until 1919 when Acadia was becoming a national park, and wonderful Zion Canyon as well. The most self-evident national park you can imagine. It took from 1882 to 1919 to finally get it made a national park, and there was still some resistance, and then a generation or two after that, Arizona decided that they were the Grand Canyon state. So, there are reasons why people resist it and worries that people have, but generally what you find, historically at least, is that over time people finally come to prize that place that had been set aside, and those immediate interests that impelled them to resist it not just get worn away because they get tired of it, they get worn away because there is a recognition that maybe there was something of lasting value and something to be proud of and something economically helpful for it. And so there are a lot of places that I think could be added, but I think I've said enough, and we should go on to other questions. But there are quite a few, and I think, and there also are some places that are national monuments that oftentimes become national parks. So I don't know if that is in your category of adding. And I think that in recent years, since the great addition that doubled the size of land that was part of the national park system in the Alaska Act of 1980, there's only been a couple of national parks that were sort of created new that hadn't already been a national monument. You know, Great Basin had been a national monument before it became a national park. Death Valley was a national monument before it became a national park. Petrified Forest, you know. So there, I think that's, but that's also a discussion now going on. There are some places that are national monuments that probably ought to stay that way, in the sense that if they become a national park, then suddenly you've got to change. As long as the protection is there of the resource, there's a good argument to say, as long as you're protecting the resource, maybe some of these great open places should be the places where you can just go out on your own, that a park ranger doesn't have to be there. I'm an honorary park ranger and believe deeply in our mission. But there's some places where it's just better that you just can go off on your own and to see it without all of the other things that accrue with the national park. So I think that is evolving as well. So change, is the only thing that we know for certain will be happening. Anybody else? Yes, sir. And then I'll get you.
What kind of an impact do you think this has, or our national parks have on foreign?
What kind of impact do they have on foreign tourists?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that as someone who's been to many of the national parks, and when we were filming, a lot of times we wanted to film in the periods when they weren't at their busiest, which meant in the shoulder seasons, in the spring and the fall. And we would be, well, a lot of times when we're filming, we don't see anybody, even when it's a busy park, because we shoot at dawn. And so we're out there an hour before the sun comes up. And, you can be in Yosemite National Park on the day before Memorial Day, and if you're up an hour before dawn, you're not going to see a lot of people. They're going to get up a little bit later. But in the parks, in those shoulder seasons in particular, it was more evident that the voices that you would hear would not be people speaking American English. They'd be Japanese, Germans, Italians, French, Brits, Aussies, and languages that I couldn't even recognize. So obviously, these are places that Stephen Mather understood so long ago that are of national importance, that for many people around the world, when they think of the United States, what images come to their mind? Disney World would be one, okay? And that is part of who we are in our culture, that is, this creative thing that has spread around. But another one is probably Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon or Zion. These great, huge, pristine, natural, spectacular landscapes that can particularly be found here, available for you to come and to see, available for you to try to experience. And so, to a certain extent, they are the affirmation of it, and obviously they think quite a bit of it because they keep coming back. We go over to see the Parthenon, and they come over here to see the Anasazi ruins. And what Stephen Mather in his See America First campaign was trying to convince people is that it's okay if you want to go there, but why don't you see us first, see America first, and then then go over and check the Parthenon out after you've done the tour of the Southwest, and if before you go to see the Alps, go to Glacier National Park. They have a profound impact on foreign visitors, and they have had a profound impact on the world because virtually every nation now has followed our model and has set aside or is setting aside places that are national parks, and they deliberately do, consult with the United States and people of the National Park Service, say, how do you do this? So it is like the idea of freedom itself is one of our greatest exports. So, down here, yeah.
This may not be of interest to everybody, but I'm wondering how you filmed the Lewis and Clark film. I felt that I'd begun in St. Louis and ended up on the Columbia. You didn't, 127 hours, and it was filmed mostly in a little town outside Salt Lake, not in Blue Ridge
No.
Canyon. Did you go over the whole,
Yeah.
the entire way?
Sure.
Over the whole trip?
His question is about the film that Ken and I did on the Lewis and Clark expedition and how we went about filming it. And this gets, if I can, gets me back, this connects to the national park idea. We wanted to tell the story of Lewis and Clark, who left St. Louis, Missouri. Actually, they left from the Illinois side of the Mississippi, went up the Missouri River, over the Bitterroots, down the Columbia, and back in 1804 to 1806. We didn't have any photographs we could use because they were inconsiderate to documentary filmmakers by leaving 40 years before the invention of photography. There weren't very many paintings that we could use. They did leave this great trove of journals of Lewis, Clark, three of the sergeants. The one died early on, and a couple of privates. Their first-hand accounts. But how do we make a film? What do we show? And what we realized as we went out to struggle with it, we got the courage to try to do it because of the power of the journals themselves, these great stories that they're telling, and the importance of the expedition. We decided that unlike the Civil War film, in which we would look into the eyes of the veterans, the people who fought the Civil War, though there were no photographs of battles, themselves, but you could look into the eyes of the people who had fought. You could see the dead bodies after the battle. With us, we couldn't look into the eyes of Lewis and Clark. We had to become the eyes of Lewis and Clark. So we would travel the route with them and hear Meriwether Lewis or William Clark or Patrick Gass or John Ordway or the others standing next to us as we looked around that bend of the Missouri River, or we saw the Great Plains for the first time as they did, or had the great disappointment of the mountains where mountains weren't supposed to exist. But it was a real chore to do that because, as I said, the American century of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century was explicitly devoted to changing the landscape. That's who we are, part of who we are. And so if I took you to where we filmed those things, which were all filmed in the places generally where they happened, as we followed their route, but if you turn that camera ever so slightly, you'd see the highway. Or you tilted up just a little bit, you would see the power line. Or if you look a little bit to the right or a little wider angle, there is the dam on the Missouri. Or a beautiful sunset, and there are the lights twinkling in the farmhouses, which obviously couldn't have been there if we're trying to put you back in the moccasins of Lewis and Clark, that you couldn't do. It was a real chore, but also a real joy to try to find those places, and we did find them, and we felt very good about that film. In doing the national parks, we didn't have any of those problems. If we wanted to show you what William Henry Jackson and Thomas Moran saw in 1871, we could go to the place that's called Artist Point in Yellowstone, named that because that's where Thomas Moran painted his famous painting of the lower falls of the Yellowstone. That point is still there, and that view is still the same, and we didn't have to worry because the whole point of the national park idea is to keep it that way. It's both, so that's a tribute to the power and the permanence of the national park idea. And additionally, it's a tribute to the National Park Service in that the landscape architects of the National Park Service back in the 20s and 30s, started by Mather and continued by Albright and others, was to say, where can we find those places in this park where you can go easily and see this place at its most majestic and to its greatest advantage? And they'll put a trail there or a turnout. You know, we prided ourselves from our Lewis and Clark thing. We would always be wanting to go around and get off the beaten path to try to find the best vantage point for it, and we'd always end up back at the turnout. You know, so many of our great shots in our film, which we're very proud of, and if people want to believe that the camera crew and I, you know, God, I can tell you how many miles we had to lug that equipment in, and if they had been there with us, they could have. If we'd left the car running, they could have heard it because it was, you know, it was 30 feet away. That's one of the great things about the national parks, you know. We went to Channel Islands National Park, just a cinematographer and I, because it was a small, you know, we weren't doing a big story about it, and so he and I went there with the park ranger to one of the main islands, and all I wanted was for us to get, you know, a roll of film in good light that would say, if you wanted to say Channel Islands National Park, what is the image you would want? The most beautiful shot with birds and stuff like that. So we went to the main island, and we're hiking along this trail on the top of the ridge of it, and we'd get down off of that, you know, through the brush and everything and look and say, is this the place? Well, no, not quite. We'd go back up, go a little bit farther, get down off on the left side of it and try that. No, it's not it. Kept doing this for, you know, hour or 2 hours. Rangers, you know, would wait each time we went down to make sure we didn't destroy something, and we'd come back up, keep going down the trail, and finally we got to a place where the trail ended. There was a park bench, and there was a little sign that said Inspiration Point. And do you want me to tell you where we found the best place to get an image of Channel Islands National Park? It was standing, you know, within an arm's length of the sign that said Inspiration Point. But that is one of the great things about the national parks. We told story after story set in the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s and the 1900s and 19-teens and so on, in which you're hearing the voices of people who were there at that time describing something, and we're showing it to you exactly as they saw it. We don't have to use special computer things to mask out stuff or anything like that. We just show it to you. And that is what the national parks are and why they are so, I think, important to us as a nation. Yes, sir.
What do you say to people who, in this certain time, say things like national parks and state parks are not worth the money, that we have other important things that need to spend money on?
I would say they should spend some money on buying a 12-hour series on the national parks and then talk to me again. No, that's the money they should be spending. In World War II, you know, which would rank almost with the Civil War in terms of a time when the Civil War was when the existence of our nation was at stake. During World War II, when the existence of freedom in the world was at stake. The leaders of our country concluded that, and there were calls that this is not a time the national park should be closed. Because we need to be dedicated to winning the war in Japan and in Germany. And the leaders of our nation decided just the opposite of that. they decided that if there was ever a time when we needed national parks, it was then. It was needed because for those servicemen leaving their homeland to fight for us might be a place where they could find, some spiritual not restoration, but inspiration before they went off. Or for those coming back, a place where they could find some solace and some quiet and restoration. It was a place where Americans who weren't involved in the fighting could still say, this is, a place that belongs to me, and this is part of what we are fighting for. The Secretary of the Interior used those phrases, so that it was good for Americans, and particularly the servicemen, to be reminded of why are we fighting? What are we fighting for? And could think of no better example of that than the national parks, which, as I said, I think is the Declaration of Independence applied to the land. And so where you're in a time like that, national parks are I would say, have proven themselves time and again to be very important. As Ken liked to say when he talks about public television and some other things, that it is not, it doesn't help, some of these things don't necessarily help protect the country, but they help represent what makes the country worth protecting. In our greatest economic cataclysm, the Great Depression, our leaders decided that the national parks were a place where a number of things were important. They invested in the national parks, not only because through the CCC did it provide much needed employment for young men who otherwise would have none, and a sense of dignity that they might have lost because they were jobless. It also provided for people in hard times a place to go. The President of the United States went on many trips to the national parks, encouraging all Americans to come and see these places because they belonged to them. They were more affordable than other places. And they were reminders in the toughest times that there is something that endures and something that binds us together as a people. And the national parks are not the only things that do that, but they are part of it. So I've worked in state governments, and I know, the demands that are placed on that, and I know that you can't always, have everything you want. But in the balancing of what's important, what's essential, and what's frivolous and everything, parks certainly are not in the frivolous category. They are part and parcel of what we want to pass on to the next generation. If you have no money, you still can pass something on to your children in the forms of these national parks and state parks. They are our inheritance from people who work very hard to make them possible for us. And they are our responsibility to make sure that our children and their children that follow them, will have it too. Otherwise, what do we say to those generations that we don't get to meet? It was kind of tough, so there went Zion. It was a nice place, but, I'm sure that if you get a job mowing the lawn for the people that have the trophy homes there past the gated community, that, you'll get an understanding of how beautiful it was when I was there, when it was a national park. Or, boy, that was some canyon when that we used to go through, and now it's under 300 feet of water, and I'm sorry you won't see it, but, times were tough. We got to be bigger and better than that. As Wallace Stegner said, they represent us at our best, and they demand the best of us in response. And is there one more question, or is that it?
That's it.
Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for coming out. And thank you for the present, too.
I feel very inadequate in saying thank you to you because you are so eloquent in saying things that we all feel so strongly in southern Utah, and I think we'd like to hire you to go to the legislature. We're having a little tough times with our state parks, and so I think we'll take you with us next time. I think this has just been marvelous. I'm sure that you will remember being here. We appreciate Mr. Duncan coming, and you can know that you're welcome to come back to Cedar City anytime you want, and we'll be here and show you a good time. 2 items of business. I want you to notice the photographs we have of Zion National Park. This is an exhibit we prepared for the 100th anniversary of Zion in 2009, and these are photographs in special collections at Southern Utah University. And Ryan Paul's students should write their name on their program. If they really think they need credit for being here, I think they've learned an awful lot. They could probably convince Ryan they've been here. But anyway, that's his role for tonight. Thank you so much. Yes, Mr. Duncan is going to be back on the back, and the bookstore is there with books, and there are some goodies out in the foyer. Thank you so much for coming.